They tell you that Santa Claus lives at the North Pole now, but that wasn't always his address. Once upon a colder time, before reindeer, before redcoats, before the world learned how to smile at winter, Santa Claus lived in New York City. They called him Diedrich Knickerbocker. Back then, a small man, an old man. The kind of man who looked like he'd been around long enough to know better, but stayed anyway. He wore outdated clothes, spoke in old ways, and carried the weight of a city that hadn't yet decided what it wanted to be. Knickerbocker had a talent for stories, dangerous ones. He took New York's past, its Dutch ghosts, its half-forgotten founders, its pipe smoke and muddy streets, and turned it into legend. He laughed at power, poked fun at pride, and stitched myth where history ran thin. And the city ate it up. They searched for him when he vanished, put his name in the papers, promised rewards, swore he was real. But Diedrich Knickerbocker didn't disappear, he retired. See, once you've given a city its mythology, once you've taught people how to believe in a place bigger than themselves, what's left? Knickerbocker looked around at New York, at the children running through crooked streets, at families scraping by, at a nation still figuring out how to be one, and decided his work wasn't finished, not even close. So he changed the story. He took the old Dutch saint, Santa Claus, the pipe-smoking bishop who drifted through folk memory like a half-remembered dream. He stripped away the sermons. He traded the staff for a wagon, turned judgment into generosity, authority into warmth. He stopped writing history, and he started delivering it. They say he left the city quietly. No announcements, no parades. Just a room left behind, a manuscript on the table, and a landlord who swore the old man skipped town owing rent. And maybe that was the point, because legends don't need forwarding address. From the rooftops of New Amsterdam to the treetops of the world, Knickerbocker became something else, something lighter. A man who traveled at night, a man who gave instead of explained, a man who understood that belief works better when you don't look too closely at the scenes. Santa Claus wasn't invented, he escaped. And New York? New York never stopped telling his story. The great hoax of 1809, and the man who became Santa Claus. At the turn of the 19th century, New York City was a place in transition, restless ambition and unsure of itself. In 1809, the city's population hovered just above 90,000. By modern standards, it was small. By American standards, it was exploding. Ships crowded the harbor. Wharves stretched into the East River. Merchants, sailors, immigrants, enslaved and formerly enslaved people, artisans, and speculators all moved through the same narrow street. New York was loud. Carts rattled over uneven cobblestones. Livestock wandered freely. Open sewers ran down the middle of roads. The smell of salt water mixed with smoke, refuse, and horse manure. This was not yet a polished metropolis. It was a working port city powered by trade and ambition. Socially, New York was deeply divided. Old Dutch families, descendants of New Amsterdam, still clung to their language, customs, and surnames. Names like Van Cortlandt, Schuyler, Stuyvesant, and Knickerbocker carried weight. These families valued tradition, land ownership, and memory. But surrounding them was a rising merchant class, English-speaking, commercially minded, and forward-looking. These New Yorkers cared less about the ancestry and more about opportunity. Banks, insurance houses, and trading firms were reshaping the city faster than tradition could keep up. Politically, the city was still finding its footing in the young American Republic. The revolution was barely a generation past. British occupation during the war had left scars, resentment, and unresolved loyalty. New York had only recently replaced Philadelphia as the nation's financial center, and its cultural legitimacy lagged behind the economic power. Boston claimed intellect. Philadelphia claimed history. New York claimed money. And money alone didn't make a civilization. What New York lacked was a unifying story. Something older than commerce. Something that could transform muddy street into meaningful ground. The city's past was inconvenient. It wasn't founded by Puritans, chasing divine destiny. It wasn't forged in revolutionary idealism. It began as a Dutch trading post, practical, tolerant, commercial, and unromantic. For some Americans, that past felt embarrassing. For Washington Irving, it felt useful. Because a city without a heroic origin is a city ripe for invention. And New York, crowded, divided, insecure, and ambitious, was ready for someone to give it one. In 1809, Washington Irving was not famous. He was 26 years old, recently returned from Europe, somewhat aimless, deeply skeptical of authority, nationalism, and self-important historian. Irving believed history wasn't just something you recorded. It was something you performed. And if New York wanted legends, like Rome or London, then maybe it needed someone to fake them first. Washington Irving did not simply write a book. He engineered a public belief. The hoax of 1809 worked because it unfolded slowly, deliberately, and through channels New Yorkers trusted. It never announced itself as spectacle. It behaved like mundane reality. The first notice appeared on October 26, 1809, buried among routine advertisements in the New York Evening Post. No dramatic headline, no flourishes, just a missing persons report. A small, elderly gentleman named Diedrich Knickerbocker, last seen leaving the independent Columbian Hotel. He was described in plain, believable terms: an old black coat, a cocked hat, an antiquated manner. This mattered. Irving understood that specificity creates credibility. The details were intentionally unremarkable, the kind of description readers had seen dozens of times before. The second move was patient. Irving waited weeks, and in that silence, curiosity grew. Who was this man? Why was no family searching for him? And why had he vanished so completely? Then came the follow-up notice. A traveler claimed to have spotted a man matching Knickerbocker's description on the road to Albany. This was crucial escalation. The story now had witnesses. It implied movement, survival, mystery, without providing answers. The audience was invited to speculate, to fill in the gaps, and most importantly, to talk. Only after the groundwork was laid did Irving introduce the manuscript. The landlord of the independent Columbian Hotel, Seth Handelside, another fictional invention, posted his own notice. Handelside claimed that Knickerbocker had left behind a very curious kind of written book in his room. Because the old man had failed to pay his rent, the landlord announced that he would be forced to publish the manuscript to recoup his losses. This was a masterstroke. The book was no longer an author's project. It was collateral. The threat of publication felt reluctant, even reluctant enough to seem ethical. Handelside wasn't seeking fame. He was settling accounts. That framing neutralized suspicion. Irving also understood the power of institutions. The New York Evening Post was not a tabloid. It was respected, reliable, and its pages carried shipping news, political updates, legal notices. If something appeared there, it carried an assumption of truth. By choosing that paper, Irving borrowed its credibility. The name Knickerbocker did the rest. It was a real Dutch surname, tied to early family. Readers recognized it. It sounded old. It sounded local. It sounded plausible. So plausible, in fact, the city itself became involved. According to later accounts, New York officials discussed offering a reward for Knickerbocker's safe return. At that moment, the hoax had crossed a critical threshold. It was no longer literature. It was civic reality. Behind the scenes, Irving continued reinforcing the illusion. He recruited friends to play along. One associate in Baltimore published a letter under the pseudonym Ludwig von Beichenfeld, swearing that Knickerbocker was real, eccentric, and personally known to him. This external corroboration mattered. It made the story portable. The hoax no longer belonged only to New York. By the time A History of New York appeared in December, the audience was primed. Readers weren't buying a book. They were resolving a mystery. And when they opened the cover, they found not an explanation, but a voice. Pedantic, rambling, opinionated. Exactly the kind of voice they imagined a missing old Dutch historian would have. The illusion held. Not because people were foolish, but because Irving understood something modern audiences still struggle with. Belief is easiest to create when no one thinks they're being asked to believe at all. When A History of New York finally appeared in December of 1809, readers expected answers. Who was Diedrich Knickerbocker? Where had he gone? What kind of mind leaves behind a manuscript so valuable it could settle a debt? What they received instead was something far stranger and far more effective. The book did not read like a novel. It read like a history written by someone who had lived too long with the past, framed as the collected papers of Knickerbocker. The book claimed to be the chronicle of New York from its mythical beginning to the era of Dutch rule. But this was not history as Americans were accustomed to reading it. It was verbose, digressive, pedantic, and obsessively detailed in the wrong places and suspiciously vague in the right one. This was all deliberate. Irving understood that parody works best when it mimics its target perfectly. Knickerbocker's voice echoed the style of real 18th century historians, men who moralized, scolded, and inflated minor events into epic struggles. Through that voice, Irving dismantled the idea that history was objective or sacred. The book ridiculed pompous governors, mocked military heroics, and treated bureaucratic squabbles as absurd theater. Dutch leaders were portrayed as stubborn, pipe-smoking traditionalists more concerned with comfort than conquest. Yet, the satire was not cruel. It was affectionate. Irving was not attacking New York's past. He was rescuing it from obscurity by making it memorable. One of the book's most radical choices was its tone. Instead of portraying colonial founders as heroic demigods, A History of New York presented them as human, petty, lazy, cautious, humorous, and deeply ordinary. This was a sharp departure from the prevailing American style of national myth-making, which leaned heavily on virtue, sacrifice, and destiny. Irving offered something else, irony. In doing so, he gave New York a past it could live with. The book also mattered because of what it smuggled in beneath the satire. Buried among jokes and exaggerations were genuine historical references, real places, real officials, real events from Dutch New Amsterdam. Many readers encountered this material for the first time through Knickerbocker's mock serious narration. For all its fiction, the book preserved cultural memory. It introduced readers to old Dutch customs, sayings, and values at a moment when those traditions were being erased by rapid growth and Anglicization. Most importantly, A History of New York reframed what it meant to belong to the city. You didn't need ancient bloodlines or heroic ancestors. You needed a sense of humor about where you came from. The success of the book confirmed something Irving already suspected. Americans were hungry for stories that questioned authority rather than worshipped it. And New York, in particular, was ready to embrace a past that was strange, ironic, and proudly unheroic. The manuscript was not just the punchline to a hoax. It was a declaration. New York would not inherit its mythology. It would invent it. So who was Dietrich Knickerbocker? Knickerbocker was everything Irving mocked and secretly admired: pedantic, opinionated, nostalgic, obsessed with Dutch past. He wore galligaskins, baggy knee breeches from another century. Through him, Irving blended real governors, invented heroes, and outright absurdity. New York's history became a tall tale, and New York loved it. To understand what Washington Irving did with St. Nicholas, you have to understand what St. Nicholas was and what he was not before 1809. In the Netherlands, Santa Claus was a religious figure. He was based on St. Nicholas of Myra, a 4th century Christian bishop known for charity, miracles, and moral authority. In traditional Dutch celebrations, Santa Claus arrived on December 6th, dressed in clerical robes, accompanied by religious symbolism and moral judgment. He rewarded good children and admonished bad ones. This figure crossed the Atlantic with Dutch settlers in the 17th century. In New Amsterdam, traces of Santa Claus survived in family customs, church records, and oral tradition, but by the late 18th century, those traditions were fading. British rule, followed by American independence, pushed Dutch language and Catholic-adjacent practices to the margins. By 1800, Santa Claus was a fragment, a name, a rumor, a half-remembered old-world custom. Washington Irving recognized the opportunity. In A History of New York, Irving, writing as Knickerbocker, did something unprecedented. He removed St. Nicholas from theology and placed him inside civic mythology. Knickerbocker did not present St. Nicholas as the church figure. He presented him as New York's patron spirit. In one of the book's most famous passages, Irving described a vision experienced by early Dutch settlers. St. Nicholas appears in the clouds, riding over the treetops in a wagon, and he lays his finger beside his nose. He smokes a pipe, and he delivers gifts. These details mattered. They were not inherited from Dutch religious iconography. They were invented, or selectively reimagined by Irving. By giving St. Nicholas a wagon instead of a horse, Irving localized the saint. By replacing the episcopal authority with domestic warmth, he transformed judgment into generosity. Most critically, Irving secularized the figure. St. Nicholas no longer represented church discipline. He represented community. This was a subtle but radical shift. Irving also tied St. Nicholas directly to New York's origin story. In Knickerbocker's telling, St. Nicholas effectively blesses the settlement of Manhattan, instructing the Dutch to claim the land as smoke from his pipe materializes into buildings. The message was clear. New York did not need divine destiny or Puritan chosenness. It had St. Nicholas, a saint who sanctioned commerce, tolerance, and pragmatism. Equally important was what Irving left out. There is no moral ledger, no threat of punishment, no emphasis on obedience. Children are not warned, they are rewarded. This made St. Nicholas compatible with Protestant America. Irving was not reviving a Catholic ritual. He was creating a cultural character. The historical evidence suggests that Irving's depiction was one of the first widely circulated American descriptions of St. Nicholas as a magical airborne gift giver. 14 years later, Clement Clarke Moore's "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" would echo Irving's imagery almost exactly, down to the nose gesture and the supernatural travel. Irving did not create Santa Claus in full, but he created the template, a secular, benevolent figure rooted in folklore rather than doctrine. A character who could evolve without religious resistance. In this sense, St. Nicholas was not imported into American culture. He was translated. From bishop to neighbor, from authority to affection, from old world ritual to new world myth. And that translation began not in a church, but in satirical history book written by a missing old man who never existed. Before Irving, Santa Claus was a Catholic bishop. Irving stripped away the robes. He replaced judgment with warmth, authority with humor. St. Nicholas becomes a pipe-smoking Dutchman. Less priest, more neighbor, a saint who belonged to the city. To modern Americans, it is difficult to imagine a time when Christmas was controversial. But in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Christmas was not a beloved national holiday. In many parts of the United States, it was effectively discouraged or outright rejected. The roots of this rejection ran deep. Much of the early American culture was shaped by Protestant tradition, particularly those inherited from English Puritans. To Puritans, Christmas was not a biblical mandate. It was a Catholic invention layered with superstition, excess, and ritual authority they had worked hard to escape. In England, Puritans had once banned Christmas entirely during the interregnum of the 1640s. That suspicion crossed the Atlantic. In New England colonies, Christmas was treated as an ordinary workday. Churches did not hold special services. Schools remained open. Celebrations were viewed as frivolous at best and sinful at worst. By the time the American Revolution, Christmas had acquired an additional stigma. It was associated with Britain. British soldiers celebrated it loudly and publicly during the war, reinforcing the idea that Christmas was foreign, aristocratic, and un-American. In the fragile years following independence, Americans were eager to define themselves against British custom. And as a result, Christmas existed in cultural limbo. Among some immigrant communities, Dutch, German, Anglican, it survived quietly in private homes, but it lacked any national meaning, no standardized tradition, no unifying iconography, and no shared emotional language surrounding the day. What did exist were older winter customs. Rowdy street celebrations, public drinking, masquerades, charivaris. These were not family-friendly gatherings. In many cities, Christmas was associated with disorder rather than warmth. Employers often dreaded the season. Elites viewed it as a threat to social order. This is why Irving's contribution mattered. He did not revive Christmas as a religious observance. He reframed it as a social one. Through his essays in the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Irving described Christmas not as doctrine, but as atmosphere. Fires glowing, tables heavy with food, music, dancing, storytelling, families and neighbors brought together under one roof. Importantly, Irving borrowed these images from England, but stripped them of their hierarchy. His Christmas was not about lords and peasants. It was about shared humanity. This vision appealed to a nation hungry for cohesion. As America industrialized, traditional community bonds weakened. Urbanization fractured extended families. Seasonal rituals offered emotional repair. Irving's Christmas offered permission. Permission to celebrate without superstition. Permission to gather without theology. Permission to enjoy winter without excess or chaos. By the 1820s and 1830s, this version of Christmas began to spread through literature, illustration, and eventually commerce. It was no accident that the holiday reemerged alongside a gentler St. Nicholas, a figure who gave quietly, judged lightly, and fit neatly into the domestic world Irving had described. Christmas did not return to America because it was rediscovered. It returned because it was redesigned, and that redesign made it safe for Protestants or Republicans, for a nation still deciding what it wanted to be. In the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Irving described Christmas celebrations filled with food, music, and family. Not sermons, together. The vision resonated, and Christmas began to return. So Knickerbocker had escaped the book. He became Father Knickerbocker, the symbol of New York. The name lived on. Knicks, Knickerbocker's Gotham. The hoax ended, the myth did not. Throughout the 19th century, Santa evolved, sometimes thin, sometimes frightening, sometimes absurd. It wasn't until Thomas Nast that Santa gained his modern form, but the heart was already there.
Did you ever wonder Think and ponder, what more is there? Is there more to fear? Can the dark illuminate? Can the light blind? What can we find?